Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you a breakdown of the image quality from the Sigma 24mm F1.4 art lens. Now this is in the Sony FE version. So as a result, I'll be doing these tests on a Sony a7R Mark III. And so at 42 megapixels, it is a higher resolution body than what most were at the time when this lens optically was released in 2015. And so in some ways, outside of course, a camera like the Nikon D800 that was around at that point, this lens is being tested a little bit more here on Sony than when it was initially released. And so, of course, it was initially released, as we saw in our first look episode. We looked at the fact that it was released, of course, originally as a lens for either Canon, Nikon, or Sigma DSLRs, and has made the transition to Sony Emount mirrorless through a new kind of physical design here. And as a part of that transition to mirrorless, because of the difference in the flange distance, things like that, the lens unfortunately has actually grown some in both size and weight. And essentially what Sigma has done is incorporated into the design, something akin to what they've done with their Sigma MC11 mount converter or adapter, but however with some unique optimizations for each individual lens and focus motor, etc., etc. And so in our final review, which will be coming shortly, I'll break down some of those improvements as compared to adapted versions of the lens and why you might want to consider an E-mount version and why you might want to consider the DSLR version. And so we'll come back to that. So the byproduct of this is that this lens is somewhat large and heavy on a Sony mirrorless body. Of course, Sigma has elected in their last about 6 years of development, starting with the art series. First one, I believe, was 2013 that was released with the 35mm f1.4. But they have elected to essentially throw out small and light compact as part of their design equation. They've focused instead on going for as large of maximum aperture as possible, and in some cases pushing the envelope of what was previously possible at a certain focal length or zoom range. And they have also tried to optimize for as good of image quality as possible, particularly at wide apertures. And so we will be evaluating this lens based on Sigma's own criteria, because obviously they've been very successful in equating the art series with sharpness and optical performance. So we're going to jump in and we're going to see how the 24mm f1.4 art in a Sony FE version holds up on a modern Sony a7R Mark III. Okay, first of all, let's take a look at the difference between a raw file that's right out of camera and then compared with using the standard profile correction in Lightroom. And so as you can see here, there is some barrel distortion that you can see. You can see the bulge here towards the center. And you can see that after the profile correction, there is a little bit of a curvature that remains there. It doesn't perfectly straighten up all the lines. And so definitely you are dealing with a little bit of barrel distortion. Also, you can see that there is a fairly persistent vignette at f1.4, not necessarily surprising at such a large aperture. And you can see that it clears up, that clears up very nicely using the standard profile. Okay, let's take a look at how that vignette naturally clears up. So f1.4 to f2, you can see that f2, there is a fairly significant vignette lift, and so you get a much more even illumination. Moving on to f2.8, and now you can see the edges are lifting, so toggling back, you can see that the vignette is now more confined to the, more the outer quarter of the image, and so you can see there's a difference at f2.8 of that lifting. Moving on to f4, there is basically no change from here's f2.8 once again to f4. It's extremely minute, and moving on to f5.6, there's not really anything to see here, and at f8, again, not really any kind of significant change. And so really between f2.8 and f4, all of the vignette clears up. So at f1.4, here in the center of the frame, we have good, if not exceptional sharpness at this point. We can also see that contrast is fairly good in the center of the frame. You can see just a little bit of haze along some of these textures where, there is room for a little bit of a contrast boost. But really, for f1.4, you have very usable resolution in the center of the frame. So what we can see as we move off towards the side of the frame is that at about the last third of the frame, there's a pretty rapid erosion of image quality. And so you can see it becomes a lot softer. And as we move up towards the extreme corners at f1.4, they really are quite soft. And looking at our centering here, I would say that it's roughly equal. The left looks a little bit better to me than what the right does. And so, there's definitely some difference there when it comes to the two sides, but it's not a huge issue either. And so centering is it's a minor part of the issue, but mostly it's just that the sharpness profile doesn't reach into the corners at f1.4. So if we put f1.4 on the left and now f2 on the right, you can see a pretty marked uptick in resolution and, more importantly, contrast in the center of the frame. And so this area here where we saw some of the textures got a little bit softer, we can see that contrast looks better. Now, if we start to move out towards the side, we do see that deterioration of image quality starts to occur, but what we see is that it's starting to occur further out. And so, for example, this area here looks much better than here, and right out to the edge of the frame. At the very edge of the frame, we are still fairly soft, but definitely improved compared to the f1.4 result. And if you move just a little bit in from the end of the frame, this definitely looks better than what this does. Up in the extreme corner, you can see it's still pretty soft here, but what we are getting is more contrast and resolution, and of course some vignette lift that helps there up in that corner. On the other side of the frame, we can see that it looks a little bit different here, but more than anything, it is lifting up some of that vignette and then a little bit of uptick in contrast. Now, comparing f2 and f2.8, in the center of the frame, there's not really a whole lot of difference to see here. There is a very, very minor bit, but not enough to really make a difference. Moving off towards the side of the frame, what we're going to see is, once again, you see that sharpness profile is just pushing a little bit further towards the edge of the frame. And so now I would say we have useful sharpness right out to the sides of the frame, and up in this top corner, it's definitely looking much more usable. You see textures starting to resolve and a better resolution taking place there. Now, if we compare f2.8 and f5.6, we see that we're arriving into the optimal apertures for like landscape type work. And now you can see the lens is extremely sharp right off to the very edges of the frame. And there's a pretty significant difference that takes place in terms of the resolution reaching into the far corners. Now, if we compare f5.6 to a smaller aperture of f11, the good news is that diffraction is not really limiting the image quality very much here. And so good news is if you're wanting extremely deep depth of field, the Sigma 24mm f1.4 art is actually still very useful at smaller apertures. So that's a plus there. Now, if we compare f1.4 to f2, this is looking at the longitudinal chromatic aberration that impacts contrast and creates some of that hazing. We can see that at f1.4 there's a little bit more of the green fringing, a little bit of the pink fringing, or magenta colored fringing, and we can see that at f2 it's already starting to clear up, and the byproduct of that is you're getting a little bit more contrast. The blacks look a little bit inkier there, and so that's a pretty common result for a wide aperture prime lens. Now, if we look at a real-world shot at f5.6, what we're going to find is that this is a compelling image when it comes to the the resolution for landscape type work. You can see that we've got sharpness right off to the edge of the frame. We've got tons of detail there in all of these trees and the foliage that is there. Holding off towards the infinity is looking quite good. In this case, I would say that the left side looks a little worse than what the right side does, and you know, that's maybe the nature of the beast with this particular lens. But anyway, I mean, even out in infinity, it looks quite good there. If I look at the left side of the frame, it doesn't look as good. It's just not resolving quite as well from that. And so there may be a very slight issue with the lens kind of focusing in a flat plane across the whole frame. Now here's another landscape image here, and so as you can see, nice contrast and resolution. This is also at f5.6, and so everywhere that we look, there's lots of detail and textures that are everywhere, and so that looks nice there. Let's check out this one for that sharpness. So it's nice on the right side of the frame, and looking on the left side of the frame, we can see that it does look a little bit softer on the left side compared to the right side. And so that does seem to be a little bit of a thing with this lens. Now I felt when I was shooting with the lens that the colors were a little bit flatter out of the Sigma than what I've been seeing. Of course, I've been shooting with a lot of Zeiss glass recently. I've been reviewing the Loxia series. And so I thought I would do a quick comparison to see if that was in my head or if that's true. What I do see here is these have been processed with identical settings taken, you know, at the identical time, both on a Sony a7R Mark III. What I do find is that I do prefer the Loxia colors as being a little bit more natural, a little bit better saturated, but in a positive kind of way. Also, we'll find that the general kind of micro contrast does favor the Loxia a little bit more, you know, to where it's not, you see there's kind of some blown out areas where it's not handling the highlights quite as well on the Sigma as it does on the Loxia. Also, if we look at kind of the color of the grass, it's a little bit more of a natural shade, and even with the sky color, which is a little bit, as you can see, a little bit richer and deeper than it is with the Sigma lens. And so it's not like the difference is massive, but I do think that the micro contrast here, as you look at various areas in the frame, I do think that it favors the Zeiss compared to the Sigma. Now that's not to say that the Sigma isn't capable of producing beautiful colors. It is. It just, like for example with this image, that I think looks fabulous. But what I've had to do is just a little bit more of post-processing than what I might have to do with a Zeiss type lens. But of course Zeiss lenses are more expensive. But it's certainly, if you know what you're doing in post, you can get fantastic color out of the Sigma lens. Now another very useful thing about the Sigma is that it does have the ability to focus down very closely, and surprisingly for a 24mm lens you actually have quite a bit of flexibility in how you treat depth of field and out of focus areas. And so you can see here nice resolution at f1.4 on our subject, and you can see that it definitely stands out nicely from the background. And even at 24mm, I find that the background is really not all that busy. It looks quite good here. Here's another example. You can see a little bit of raindrops in the air here. But what this allows you to do, again, playing with depth of field, is that you can compose kind of how you would like. And so I have used this mum blossom here, compose low down, and then to allow a lot of defocused area. And so as you can see, you definitely can produce a reasonable amount of bokeh out of this lens if you just shoot accordingly. Okay, while it was suboptimal conditions, I was able to get out and shoot some stars here, and so we'll take a quick look at what I found there. So first of all, we're looking here wide open at f1.4 in this particular image, and so as you can see, obviously this is a good focal length for shooting stars. But let's take a look at our actual star points here and see if there's anything to glean here. So at the center of the frame, what I'm seeing is something that was akin to what I saw when I did a review of the 24 to 35mm f2 art lens. And that is that even with a moderate shutter speed, in this case we are looking at 15 seconds. And so 15 seconds is typically safe in that you're not getting a tremendous amount of movement of the stars. And so what we are seeing here is that rather than having purely circular shapes, there's a little bit of star point stretching. And that was what I found with the 24 to 35 as well, that instead of being a kind of single point of light, it was more of like almost like a dash, as you can see in some cases. Then you can also see that some of the brighter points, and this would be more manifest on nights where there was a higher amount of contrast. Conditions were really not very fantastic the night I shot, but you can see that there is some deformation wide open of star points along the edge of the frame, and particularly the brighter points of light. And so that is some evidence of some coma that is present there. And so, I mean, at the same time, you know, your big plus here is that f1.4 sucks in a tremendous amount of light. And so in this case, even though the conditions were really very poor, in fact, I could only see with the naked eye, I could only see some of these actually these brighter star points. I mean, I was looking up at the night sky and, you know, I was seeing, you know, maybe 10 or 15 star points. And so, you know, plus side is you're able to suck in a lot more star evidence, but not if you're, you know, the perfect geometry is important to you, then that's not so much happening here. Now here I have stopped down to f2.8. Now I looked at f2 also. I saw a mild improvement of kind of the actual coma type performance, but what I didn't see, and I'm still not seeing here even marked on down to f2.8, is a reduction of these kind of you know, dash or elongated star points. And what we see as we move towards the edge of the frame, you see a little bit more of the wings that are growing on there. So unfortunately, even at f2.8, there is a bit of a coma that is there and not cleared up. As I've been going through the review process with this lens, one thought that has been recurring to me is the thought that Sigma has obviously continued to get a lot better with their design in the art series. Now, that's not to say that the 24mm f1.4 art isn't a strong performer. It is relative to the competition that it's had in the past. And of course, we're about to see whether or not the new Sony 24mm f1.4 G Master is able to best it. I wouldn't be surprised if it did, because it's a modern version, and Sony has been very successful in developing these G Master lenses. Of course, that will come at a price premium of, you know, somewhere around $400 or $500 more than what this lens is, and so you'll have to weigh whether or not that's worth it to you at that point. But at the same time, as I compare it to more recent entries in the art series, I find that Sigma is doing a better job, for one, at optimizing corner performance. And we saw with this lens that it's very sharp in the center of the frame and very sharp over, you know, somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of the image circle, even at f1.4. The corners, however, and edges of the frame are still, you know, fairly soft, and there's some improvement by f2, but not massive amounts. Better at f2.8, but really it's not until f4 where the corners become exceptionally sharp. And I would say that peak landscape aperture is somewhere around f5.6. And so, you know, lenses like the new 14 to 24mm f2.8 art, for example, they are sharper already, even wide open at f2.8 in the corners, than what this lens is. And so Sigma has gotten better at this, and I also feel like Sigma has gotten better with things like, you know, dealing with coma, and also in their color rendition, a little bit more vibrant colors coming off the lens. And so in some ways, this lens shows the progress that Sigma has made over that time. And so I'm kind of evaluating it by a different criteria in 2018 than what one might have in 2015. And in some ways, it hasn't survived as well compared to the current competition and current bodies that we're testing it on as it did at that point. But I will, at the same time, I mean, I've gotten a lot of really fantastic images, and I do love the fact that it focuses down closely in that large maximum aperture. It allows me to have some variety in the kind of photos that I can take with a lens like this. Not just typical, you know, city or landscape type shots, but I can also get in close and throw things out of focus, do some storytelling with the actual images that I can take. And that to me is something I value personally, because it adds a lot of versatility to what I can do with a particular lens. So stay tuned for my final review, and if in the meantime you want to look at more images, take a look in the description down below, and you can find linkage there to my ongoing image gallery, and I'll continue to add photos through the end of this review. And on top of that, you can find buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. And there also you can follow me on social media, you can become a patron. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button and stay tuned for my soon coming final review and some of the comparison and contrast of how this lens performs on Sony. That will be coming to you shortly. Have a great day.